Victor Wembanyama stood in the middle of the stone courtyard, barefoot, his breath visible in the cold morning air. A light drizzle from the night before still lingered in the cracks between the tiles. It was silent, eerily so, except for the rhythmic stomp of feet and the sharp exhales of the monks beside him. They moved like water. Every motion was a whisper, every strike a declaration. Wembanyama wasn't trying to blend in. He was trying to become something else entirely. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't the journey anyone imagined for the so-called once-in-a-generation unicorn, a 7'4" phenom, handpicked by destiny to reshape the future of basketball. But here he was, thousands of miles from the roar of NBA arenas. No cameras, no reporters, no Instagram highlights, just discipline, silence, and the haunting thought that he might have lost it all. Months earlier, Wemby sat in a cold, clinical room, clutching a piece of news that felt like a death sentence, a blood clot. Not a sprained ankle, not a twisted knee, something far darker, something that threatened his career, his identity, his life. In those moments, it didn't matter how many hype reels they'd made or how many articles called him the next LeBron. Fear is an equalizer, and for Victor Wembanyama, fear didn't knock. It burst through the door. You need to understand, this wasn't just about missing games. This was existential. Basketball wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. The game had raised him, shaped him, crowned him. And now, it might vanish. One freak diagnosis and everything he'd sacrificed, his childhood, his time, his body, could become just a chapter in a what could have been story. So he left. Not in shame, not in surrender, but in search. The Shaolin Monastery wasn't rehab. It was transformation. No agents, no teammates, no trainers. Just monks who didn't care if you were the #1 pick. They only cared if your kicks had rhythm, if your mind was still when your body ached, if you could endure. At dawn, Wemby woke up before the sun. He trained with monks half his size but twice his balance. He learned to strike, not to hurt, but to control. 1,000 kicks a day, repeated until his muscles screamed, until sweat soaked the earth, until the pain gave way to clarity. And maybe, just maybe, he needed this more than a shooting coach. Because what if the hype had been too much? What if the NBA spotlight had cast shadows on his soul? Out here, there were no lights, just the truth. And the truth was, Victor was scared, but he wasn't running from that fear. He was learning to master it. In the stillness of that ancient temple, the future of the NBA sat cross-legged, breathing slowly, deliberately. The same breathwork Bruce Lee had once taught. The same rituals Kareem had embraced decades earlier when he trained with Lee. Not to fight, but to understand the self. But here's the twist. Kareem was already a legend. Wemby was still becoming. So this wasn't about legacy. This was about survival. When the world last saw Wembanyama, he was blocking shots with his elbow, hitting pull-up threes like a guard, and bending the game in ways that made scouts shake their heads. But even that version of him had cracks. His shot looked clunky, his stamina wavered, and now with his health in question, those cracks could become chasms. But not if he could rebuild himself. Stronger, calmer, focused. When he finally returned from China, his body was leaner, his movements more precise, but more importantly, his eyes had changed. There was still joy, still hunger, but behind that, something new had formed. A quiet storm. One that no headline could capture. And when the Spurs training camp opened that fall, the NBA didn't know what was coming. Not yet, but they would. Because Wembanyama hadn't just trained his body, he had trained his fear. And what he was about to unleash would change everything. Back in San Antonio, the NBA world was scratching its head. Victor Wembanyama had just returned from a monastery halfway across the planet, transformed in silence, while the rest of the league screamed into the off-season chaos. Meanwhile, the Spurs front office had made moves so strange, they bordered on reckless. No super team, no elite shooter acquisitions, just a curious set of puzzle pieces that didn't seem to fit. It began with a promise. De'Aaron Fox was the first domino. A lightning bolt in sneakers, a veteran in his prime, with a first step so fast it made defenders question physics. He wasn't just traded to San Antonio, he was courted, assured, and handed a max contract before he'd even laced up in a Spurs jersey. 4 years, $229 million, That wasn't just an investment, it was a marriage, one built on trust. But even that made sense on paper. Pair Wemby with a dynamic slashing guard, that's classic basketball architecture. It was what came next that sent analysts into spirals.
With Fox in place, the Spurs drafted Stephon Castle, a rookie guard with a grown man's frame, a defender so locked in he could pick your pocket and your soul. Castle wasn't flashy, he wasn't a sniper, but he played with a tenacity that screamed playoff basketball, grit, intensity, but also a complete overlap with Fox, another slasher, another guard who operated best with the ball in his hands, another player who couldn't stretch the floor beyond the arc. And then the draft lottery rolled its dice. Dallas had stolen the headlines. Cooper Flagg went #1 to the Mavericks. That was the story ESPN couldn't stop talking about. But while the cameras obsessed over Luka's new sidekick, the Spurs quietly hit jackpot. A 6.3% chance turned into the #2 pick, and with it came Dylan Harper, the second best prospect in the class. A 6'6" freight train with a scorer's mentality, a high basketball IQ, and a flair for improvisation. The kind of player that usually ends up being the guy. Except now, Harper was walking into a team with 2 other guys already taking up the lane and the spotlight. That's 3 guards, all slashers, all creators, none elite shooters. In a league dominated by spacing, where analytics have practically banned the mid-range shot and crowned the three-pointer king, this trio was a basketball sin. A recipe for congestion, for awkward rotations, for clogged paint and frustration. But the Spurs didn't blink, because they knew something the rest of the world didn't. This wasn't a normal team, and Wembanyama wasn't a normal big. You see, when most franchises land a generational big man, they follow a script. Surround him with shooters. Give him space. Let him operate with clean reads. Think of Shaq with Kobe and a bevy of wing threats, Hakeem with his floor spreaders, Duncan with Parker and Ginobili running sets. But San Antonio, they shredded the script. They looked at Wemby and said, why not try something we've never seen? Because here's the thing, Wemby is the spacing. He's the rim protector and the floor spacer, the post anchor and the transition finisher. His gravity isn't limited to one end of the floor. It warps everything. On defense, guards like Fox and Castle don't have to worry about chasing perfect angles or avoiding risky plays. They can overcommit, gamble, jump passing lanes, because behind them is a 7'4" safety net with a wingspan that eats light. On offense, even when Fox drives and the paint looks crowded, it's not. Because Wemby isn't standing on the block clogging things up. He's floating around the arc. He's sprinting into open space. He's dragging centers 28 feet from the basket because he can hit from there. And that changes everything. Most teams would look at this roster and see chaos. The Spurs saw opportunity. They saw a chance to play faster, with more motion, more improvisation, more unpredictability. And in a league where teams are constantly trying to copycat each other, build the next Warriors, the next Nuggets, the next Celtics, San Antonio's act. They embraced the weird. It was a gamble, a bold one. Because if Wemby had remained the player we saw in the first few months of his rookie year, tentative, stiff on jumpers, a little slow to react, then this whole setup would collapse under its own weight. But that wasn't the Wemby who came back from China. This version of Wembanyama, he was different.